Give us 30 minutes each week to discover the trends that are shaping the future of retirement with That Annuity Show. We bring you conversations with industry leaders who are revolutionizing financial products, technology, and distribution channels. Now, here's your host, Paul Tyler.
Hi, this is Paul Tyler, and welcome to another episode of That Annuity Show. Bruno, welcome again.
Thank you. Good morning.
Tisa, great to see you again, twice, actually, virtually and in person this week.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, twice in a week. Good morning, everyone. I look forward to the recording today.
Yeah. So anyway, listen, today we are thrilled to have a returning guest. Okay. This is amazing. Susan Norman came back, and we love it. We had you, Suzanne, on our show. I think must have been in 2020, maybe. For those of you who don't know Suzanne, she is a thought leader in retirement planning. And she really is exploring some very key issues that shape the financial, and I want to underscore this, emotional landscape for today's retirees. I think we'll dig more into that topic. But Suzanne, welcome, and tell us, what's happened. Catch us up.
Sure. Thank you. Great to be here today. And yes, time flies, right? I can't believe that it's been 4 years, but I will cover this, I think, today with some of your questions. But I made a transition into a next chapter. I call it a rewirement. But last time I was with you, I was a principal at Milliman, had been there 9 years and spent technically 29 years in the investment industry, but really felt a pull towards getting into this conversation in next chapters in purpose. And I was training as a professional coach, going back to sort of my roots of psychology. And what's been wonderful is that I've been able to continue working with the Retirement Income Institute and the Alliance for Lifetime Income, where I was on a couple of projects when I was at Milliman. So it's great to be here and share some of that work that I've been doing amongst other fellows and the Alliance.
Yeah, well, that's great. And by the way, we love the Alliance for Lifetime Income. We have Cyrus on the show. We had a few of the researchers on here. We actually did a live annuity show recording at an Alliance for Lifetime. Alliance for Lifetime Income in Atlanta at the Rolling Stones concert. That was
right.
That was a lot of fun.
Those were fun. Oh, that's great.
All right, who gets the first question here for Suzanne?
Well, I'm happy to, and I think in one of your posts you did mention that there's always the question from retirees and pre-retirees who think and ask, how much do I need in retirement? Mm-hmm. And we all know that it's a loaded question. And I feel like when I'm asked that question, I feel like I have 10 seconds to figure out what their knowledge is, what tangent they want to go through, how to, and where the conversation is going to go. What is their personal situation? Mm-hmm. And we all know it's not a one size fits all. My question is, from a psychology background, from a financial background, how do you address that challenge when people come to you and ask you those extremely loaded questions, and you have 10 seconds to figure out and anticipate how every single person is going to react and anticipate the next question? So how do you handle that?
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. Way to give me a really simple question as we start, but I'm glad we did start there, because I have the conversation every day, not just professionally and working with the Alliance, with my friends, with my family. As I think you know, I've been very involved in teaching financial literacy since about 2016. I created my own program, but now I actually work as co-chair of CFA Society Boston's Financial Literacy Initiative. So I really bring it to that conversation, meaning that we have, as we see the surveys every year, Council of Economic Education, we get very little formal financial literacy education. So it is no surprise that people are approaching retirement with that trepidation. I would say the simple answer, and you said it, Bruno, which is, I try to take my psychology hat along with, my financial hat, right? Because as I mention all the time, and especially as a coach, we've got the head and we've got the heart, right? So we've got to create this pathway. So the first thing I do is acknowledge that it is a hard question. And we all know this academically, right? No one knows when they will die, right? So we're missing a key element of that formula. So I like to start with something that's pretty easy, and that is, what's your inflow? What's your outflow? Now, we know that only about a third of people follow or create a formal budget, but that's the first place I want to start, because that's a level set. You're meeting them where they are. Everybody understands a budget. And it's the same with retirement. Now, at the summit, I know we're going to talk about our research summit we just had, but a dear friend, a financial advisor, talks about lifestyle preservation. So I think that there's an element of trying to figure out what they're going to do in retirement. And we'll probably talk about purpose in a little bit. So the first thing I try to do is just determine, do you know what your inflow looks like, and do you know what your spend looks like? And then we can go into needs, wants, wishes, right? So, we talk about that in financial literacy. What are the needs that you have? What are the wants? And we have to have both. So the I guess bottom line, to be prescriptive or pracademic, as Jason Fichtner, who runs the institute, calls it, we have the RISE score. Milliman created this fintech tool. So those of you that are listening, if you haven't looked at this, it's free. The inputs are very, very minor. We have about 5 or 6 inputs. I always say to my friends, when this question comes up, go track it. Go put these inputs in, and you'll figure out what your readiness is. And it was designed to look like a credit score. So I guess, Bruno, the simple way is to say, I want to listen. I want to give them some tools to be thinking about exactly what their financial retirement lifestyle looks like, but also give them something that lets them really kind of have that real financial sense of where they are. So the RISE score, Retirement Income Security Evaluation Score, by the way, that's an acronym.
And that's backed by the and it was inaugurated by the Alliance for Lifetime Income, which is form of the top insurance/asset managers in the financial industry. So it's not some tool that someone put together. Like, it's a very formal, it's a very formal and robust tool, yet simple, that people can address, people can use to, maybe make sure they ask themselves the right questions, and at least guide them in the right direction, if I understand this correctly.
Exactly. It is. It's just a brief input, and it will give you a sense. And to your point, I always talk about the Michelangelo quote, or at least it's attributed to Michelangelo, which is, the height of sophistication is simplicity. And Bruno, you're an actuary, so I want to give a nod that actuaries created this. But it is, from a user interface standpoint, very simple for people to use. So I do send friends there all the time.
So the actuaries created the simplicity or the complexity of it?
I think the best actuaries do both, right? They are masters in math, but also make sure that they are understood. And I know we'll talk a little bit about communication as well on the podcast. So yes, it's on the Alliance for Lifetime Income website. It is free. There's no tracking, so no one's going to sell you anything. So I like people to know that resource is available. And I wrote a paper on it, just a short institute note to help explain, back to simplicity, what it's all about.
Well, speaking of the Alliance of Lifetime Income, you were there. The summit was a week or two ago, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, we had it the 8th and the 9th of October in Washington, D.C. So this has been, I believe, the 5th year. But at least, yes, we like to bring together all of our research fellows, all of our members, the media, advisors. And at the end of the day, it's all about the consumer. So we actually include consumers in the summit, which is really fun. I actually was able to host a panel with some consumers and researchers. So that was fun.
Yeah, so we get a lot of good feedback and echoes from those sessions where, we could all be in this room with all of our process and procedures and all of our professional backgrounds and come up with the best solution. But at the end of the day, we're serving people, and we've heard a lot of that feedback of real people struggling with real problems. How do you address those? How do you fix those? What are some of the? So, can you talk a little bit about some of the takeaways that have come from those particular sessions?
Absolutely. I think we try to, of course, showcase our research because our fellows are producing just an incredible amount of information. And I mentioned before that one of the terms we use is pracademic, which is we want to take all of this academic research, or someone like me who's an education fellow, not a PhD, not doing original research per se, but we want to take it and bring it to a practical level because we do know one of our main research papers that came out this year was Peak 65 by Jason Fichtner, who leads the Institute. And we know people are nervous, and bringing the consumers into this conversation helps us really hear what's going on in their lives. What are some of the things that we know from an industry and an academic standpoint that can help solve the problems? And I think one of the things that was really interesting to me was the kind of thread of emotions that went through. Now, we did kick off the summit with Richard Leiter, who, those of you that aren't aware of Richard's work for decades, he's one of the pioneers in the purpose movement. So as a professional coach, I'm in awe of what he's created and brought to the world, this awareness of that connection to purpose. That came out a lot from the consumers, really, thinking about that next chapter, because retirement, I use the term rewirement, because most people are retiring at an age now where they're going to live a number of decades. And, if they're not working, then maybe they have the luxury of having financial stability. But a lot of people, and my father's a great example, need the intellectual stimulation. Now, he was a entrepreneur, or is an entrepreneur, so he's still managing, involved in his companies. He's 85. So I think, listening to the consumers talk about that, what's important to them was really, really critical. Now, it doesn't take away from the fact that our protected retirement income and planning study, which we, of course, venue that every year as well, is pointing to some things that I think are really important for us to address. So I would just mention, and we can go deeper if you want, that we are seeing when we survey, which it's very unique, this protected retirement income and planning study, we call it PRIP, which comes out every year. We survey at the same time, which is unique, the consumer, the investor, and the financial professional. So this year, what we learned, there's a lot of communication gaps. So when we start thinking about this conversation or conversations that are happening with advisors and their clients, it's not that people aren't doing a good job. It's the old saying, which is, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. And we identified a lot of gaps. And so that was definitely part of the conversation with the consumer. For instance, when we look at some of the, elements of protection, right? So, do you want protection in your retirement plan? Do you want protection in general in your investment accounts? We're seeing, a significant gap where we ask about the frequency of conversations. And when you ask an advisor or the advisors in our survey, is protection important to your clients? We're seeing that there's about a 20-point gap between what they're saying and what the consumers are saying, meaning consumers want it. So this is something that we want to spend a little bit more or a lot of attention on, is looking at those gaps. So I have other examples, but that was a big takeaway, Bruno, for me.
Oh, thanks. And that makes perfect sense.
So I want to kind of stay on the takeaways from the research summit and go back to the Peak 65 that you mentioned up front, and just go back to maybe explaining that a little bit more for those listening, and then we can talk about kind of why that's pivotal in retirement planning and what that's going to inform us doing differently going forward.
Thank you. And back to communication and jargon. So thank you for checking me on that. I had a little jargon there, didn't I? So Peak 65, we've actually trademarked it. And this concept is that at no time in the U.S., or I would say globally, but we're looking at the U.S., have we had as many people turning 65. So, in the next, couple of years, we will see more people over 65 than, under 18. So Peak 65 is addressing the fact that we have over 4 million people turning 65 each year, over 11,000 every day. So this is sort of that peak of the baby boomers entering this phase of maybe thinking about retirement. Some aren't. My dad, again, maybe an outlier example, but that's what we're addressing. There is this cohort of people and this massive movement into retirement.
You also mentioned purpose, so maybe there's like the connection point of, aging population, maturing population, and the faced with that crossroads of those decisions at the expected age, right? That's kind of like the age you dream about, talk about, plan for, and then the reality of when you hit that age and what you actually feel like doing, whether it's still working, different or second career. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the psychology of that peak and what we're seeing different?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I don't want to underemphasize the fact that, of course, we do in our research, and this is not again going to be a news flash. There is a lot of nervousness, right? People are nervous about retirement, meaning have Bruno's question earlier, have I saved enough? I don't even know how to do this formula. And then clearly we've got, and particularly as women, the Gen X caregiver experience and even the Peak 65 baby boomers who have been taking care of parents. So I guess I want to level set a little bit that this is not all, a puppies and rainbows story, but purpose, I think, really is elemental to this shift because taking sort of a page out of my coach life, I think values tend to be pretty fixed in our lives, meaning, what is a compass point? Now, for me, it's learning, it's, honesty is a big one for me. So these are things that are sort of hardwired in us. Purpose, I think, is something that can change, right? So being out Halloween last night, I met with a lot of my friends, and I'll be 59 in January. So most of my friends have just entered the empty nest phase of life. So there's that identity shift that's happening. So I like to think of purpose as something that can change as we mature or we go through different phases of life. So with purpose and this retirement conversation, I think and Richard has written extensively about this. We actually just co-authored a paper for the Institute just to highlight some of the elements of purpose. But the research is incredibly strong about having a purpose and finding your purpose. We also have a workbook that talks about finding your purpose, so that's kind of fun. So I know you'll probably have the link after when this goes to the world. But the idea of purpose is this: what are the gifts? What are the passions? What are your values? And that equals purpose. And as I work with people all the time, it's not necessarily something that you wake up and you recognize where that shift has happened, right? Meaning you might know there's a shift happening, meaning I've educated my children, they're out of the house, they're, in college or, working. But now what? And maybe, I like my career, or maybe I'm looking for something different. So there's a little work that goes into it, Tisa, but I think that the science is there, the research is there showing that when we can connect to that, we are happier. Some of you, and you may have had guests on before talking about the Harvard study of adult development. And this is something that Dr. Bob Waldinger is, I think, the third person running it. It's been running since 1938, studying, what makes people happy, what is a full life, and purpose really is really a pathway into that satisfied life. And we also know that connections are huge. So the workbook that I'm referencing that was built on Richard Leiter's, decades of research and work helps people figure out what that is and also how to fund it.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't think I've actually read it. It's interesting, Suzanne. I've heard a lot of people talk about it. So, if we can find the link, we'll put it in the show notes. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, purpose. Maybe we've talked a lot about the numbers, the math, and I think maybe we talk a little bit more about the emotions and psychology of retirement. I agree with you. I have a lot of conversations with people at my age now about what are they going to do, and what I tell them, and I think we actually had somebody, I don't know, Bruno or Tisa on the show talk about you need a purpose and a posse if you're going to be happy.
Yeah.
It's easy to remember.
Yeah.
And I have one friend my age. He said enough. Sold his expensive house and expensive real estate. Moved to the mountains. No income tax. By the way, not many people, but I see pictures of the mountains. Okay, really? You're gonna do that for 25 years? How do you have any studies in terms of like how does this? There almost must be a path of finding a purpose over the course of your 25 odd years in retirement. Is there?
Well, the formula that Richard uses, which is in the workbook, which I love because there is a lot of simplicity there in the workbook. Being a workbook, it lets someone, actually use it. And so going back to this communication, and, I want to reference back to an advisory relationship, meaning that a lot of financial advisors out there are trained in, portfolio management. How can I help you achieve your goals financially? This new frontier is naturally going to be an emotional frontier as well. So what I love about the workbook is something that you as an advisor can use with your client, right? So the gifts that I mentioned before are, what are those unique talents that you have? What is it that you're good at? For me, and I use myself a lot when I speak, I knew that there was a shift that was coming. I felt it might have happened a little bit earlier. At 50, I took on a work project that was interesting. So that delayed it a little bit. But I know that I love to speak and I love to teach and women's empowerment. So I've actually built this whole series of presentations now. And if you'd asked me, Paul, since you interviewed me, 4 years ago, if that's where I would be today with this whole Wealthy Woman series, Wealth and Health, it's WH.
Right.
I would have said, well, that would be interesting. I don't know how I'm going to get there. So the thing I often say to people is be patient, right? This is not, your career didn't happen overnight, nor will this new purpose happen overnight. But getting really clear on those things that you really love to do, and then those passions. And one thing that I want to invoke Richard here as well, because he stresses this so much. You talked about posse, right? This pack. A sounding board is really helpful. So people that you trust, that are close to you, it could be a professional mentor, it could be a friend, family member, but having that sort of stable of people that are helping you. And as a coach, I always talk about accountability. It's always great to have an accountability partner. But again, it is usually about other people, meaning that purpose, those gifts and passions, your values are usually intended to be shared with the world.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
I've heard it referred to as your personal board of directors.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
exactly.
well, and I personally relate to that because, a couple of years ago, I actually hired went through two coaches, got something from each one, and said, well, what do I really want to do for X number of years? Because I think you get a certain point in your life. It's not about the money; it's about more like where am I going to invest my time and what's the personal ROI in it. I don't need a yacht, right?
Yeah.
but
Well,
what
Paul? That's interesting. I want to reference that because Richard and I put that in our institute note related to work. So you mentioned it. Yes, there are a lot of us that are fortunate that we have financial freedom, we have financial resources. One thing that I learned about myself, because making this transition, it was not necessarily about replacing or increasing my income necessarily, but I've worked since I was 15. I like making money. And we put in the institute note I didn't want to really I didn't want to go to the point of does somebody have to work, but I wanted to go to the essence of how many people in our, the baby boomers, the Gen X generation are actually still going to be in the workforce. It is growing exponentially. So the one thing I would say back to creating, knowing your purpose, finding your purpose, it's also really thinking about, you don't necessarily have to exit the workforce, right? You may not necessarily be employed. You may be, setting up your own LLC, but there's an element to certainly the connections that we keep when we're in the workforce, and certainly I think the insights that we can share, multi-generational.
So I want to stay on the topic of emotions because I think it's a very important one. And arguably, if there are two big worries that retirees and pre-retirees have is longevity and healthcare. And, those two are just major unknowns. And it feels like it's, the industry has been struggling on both ends, long-term care, lifetime income. And it feels like there's a disconnect with whenever it comes down to having products or solutions that are both insurance based and investment based, and they have some sort of a spin. Like they each have their own spin, and we see a lot of issues with with carriers, with compensation, and most importantly with the consumer, and how consumers react and to those potential value proposition, saying like, oh, if you buy lifetime income, if you die earlier, you lose everything. If you buy long-term care, if you don't use it, you lose everything. And that is usually a big no-go, a big showstopper. But at the same time, the risk pooling is necessary in order to make the product appealing from a risk pooling, from a statistical perspective. How do you address all of these issues? And I understand it's a multifaceted problem that has a lot of like each of those issues have intricacies with each other. How do you address those? What would be like the first few initiatives that either the industry can take to address those and make a positive move forward for consumers?
Yeah. Well, a lot to unpack, Bruno. Thank you for being my complex questioner. However, I would say a few things to keep it relatively simple, and certainly there's further reading that will provide. But I think it gets back to the emotional pathway, meaning that I can answer, especially as a financial literacy educator, that you can do just a few things with risk, right? Meaning we all have risk in our lives, and the insurance industry is the primary place to go to transfer it. You can avoid risk, which I think does happen to a lot of people, especially when they don't have all the inputs for this formula we're talking about for retirement income. You can absorb it. So there's clearly, an ability for some people to say, I don't need to transfer my risk, and I'm not avoiding it. I know what my risk is. I've done my T-chart. I've figured it all out, and I have enough money. And perfect example, which is not our topic today, but, PNC, where we look at flood insurance. And I live in Boston. I have a house on Cape Cod. Luckily, I'm not in a flood zone, but I do buy flood insurance, I might add. But I do have a lot of friends that have property in Florida, and they are fortunate. They don't have a mortgage, and they have said, we're not buying any coverage. So anyway, that's going down a whole other pathway. But just to say, when I have these conversations with people, I do start with sort of the math of saying, what are you going to do with your risk? The thing that's so interesting, and this is another major research paper that we published this year by David Blanchett and Michael Finko, which is Guaranteed Income, a License to Spend. And so I know we want to connect the dots, right, with this sort of, the math and the emotions. Really interesting paper, because what we found is almost 60% of people said they would feel more comfortable if they had $10,000 extra money to spend on non-essentials, right? So let's just say it's a vacation, right? Versus receiving $140,000. And what I thought was so interesting about that result in the research, and again, I'll point everyone to the paper to look in greater detail, but we saw that very few people spent more money than they had. So I guess the best way to say it is that we know that people are conserving because they don't know. And you mentioned, Bruno, healthcare costs. I mean, there are a lot of things that are pulling at us, right? So I guess when I think about the emotions, and the title of the paper says it all, which is there is this conservation that's happening. People are under consuming. I mean, psych, of course, behavioral finance is going to teach us a lot about these behaviors, loss aversion. We've got, another term that I've been using a lot in what I write, chromatophobiia, which is this fear of spending money. And so anyway, having this guaranteed income gives people a license to spend. And it's really fascinating when you do think about people that have said, I just, I'm afraid. And I knew a lot of these people in Florida who had lots of money and wouldn't fix the roof.
It doesn't surprise me. And we've heard it over and over that license to spend is kind of the counterbalance of longevity risk. It's like, oh well, I'm the longevity risk is very real, and I may arrive at a certain age and not having any money and still be alive. Like, that's a big problem. So what do? You underspend and you underspend, and that translates into lack of enjoyment. It translates into even lack of care. I mean, it's I'm not going to spend on the doctor because I may run out when I live longer. So license to spend, that I think that's a fabulous concept. Great, great tagline. We certainly love it. So no, I think that's a very important topic.
Yeah, well, time goes fast. We're almost at the end of the show. Suzanne, maybe you just, TT's kind of started going down this avenue, but maybe just talk a few minutes about emotions. This will be my sort of last question here. Big question, short question is, how do we get better at opening those emotional dialogues with consumers? I had a real interesting experience with a big firm. You all know it. I've got a lot of money. It's a lot of self-directed people there. I won't tell you the color of their branding, but you know it. I had one guy call in. He was sort of the lead generator, I guess, guy. Asked me these questions, saying like, I wanted to hear what he was going to ask me to do his little quote plan. It was like, this is all you're going to ask me? Okay. Well, I'll send you the plan. Thank you. Oh, and would you like to talk to this other person? Well, okay. Here's the date. So I said, okay, fine. I'll talk to this person. And so I finally had an evening call. The guy calls up and he looks at my, he says, oh, you're pretty well off. You've done pretty good there. Oh, you got a lot of, you're still making money. Okay. What else can I do for you? No questions. How do you feel? Where are you in this progression? I mean, there were a lot of questions that didn't get asked that probably could have ended up in a client relationship. I mean, I don't need somebody to help me figure out what percentage goes to bonds and equities. Sorry, that's just, for me, that's not it. What's the recipe for this?
Well, I think that you've just pinpointed, another complication, which is, it's interesting to me to hear that you actually had someone engage with you and produce a formal plan. So already you're sort of an outlier because, we tend to say that it's less than 10% of people actually have that experience. But what you've also pointed to is, I think, the default with a lot of people that are busy, right? And really there's a lot of risk in having a financial relationship, meaning, you want to do the right thing financially. And then once you start getting into the emotions, that's sort of the Wild West, right? And I think that, the better practitioners that I see, and I'm fortunate to count a number of my closest friends as financial advisors, professionals, are the ones that just carve out that time. And I always say that the two words that we have, all of us in our lexicon, are what and how. And then we remember the ratio, right? 2 ears, 1 mouth. We just listen. And I hopefully you'll let me take a little liberty here with going beyond the question to the gender aspect, which
yes,
is
please do.
that certainly in the silent generation, which we still have, of course, a number of clients in that age group, more, of course, longevity, the baby boomers, women do tend to have other responsibilities that we take on. So we're taking care of the kids, we're out of the workforce further, more, we're taking care of our parents. This is nothing, again, as I say, I love my male allies and being pro-female, not anti-male. What's happening more and more, I think, is advisors recognizing if we're having this planning conversation, whether it's formal or informal, making sure that they're talking to the spouse and the female spouse, because she may have very, very well delegated this responsibility to her partner, But again, I'll talk about my parents. I do all the time. My father, I have to give him a lot of credit. Years ago, said to my mother, it's not optional. You need to know what this is. And she's incredibly smart. She just wasn't that interested. Right. And it was just not part of how she grew up. And many of us didn't have that education. All to say that I think the better advisors that are doing the planning are recognizing that the questions need to go separately to each person, right? So that it's not just the collective, what do you think? It's the, Paul, what do you think? And, Bruno, what do you think? Or Tisa, what do you think? So there's that listening and the questions are coming to both of them. And I know this statistic is repeated often. I think it's directionally correct. I always struggle with finding the trustworthy source of it, but we do know that if you're a financial advisor, if the relationship was with him and he passes away, or when he passes away, a lot of women leave that advisor. Whether they're male or female. So, we do have a majority of male advisors out there still, but I think that planning question, Paul, yes, there needs to be comfort in having these emotional conversations or having someone on the team that asks the open-ended questions to both and recognizing it's a business preservation.
That's great. Well, Tisa, thoughts, questions, reactions to that?
Well, I did have a follow-up question. How does that, thinking through the emotions of all of what you just mentioned, Suzanne, like how does that shift when there's not a partnership to probe? It's an individual. So I'm going to go with like a single woman, professional, sort of, right, in charge of their own finances, their own planning, still have maybe the children responsibility and still have the aging parent responsibility. So all of the same dynamics, but really it's one decision maker and it's one direct line of questioning and interaction. Questions the same, questions different. Just Can you speak a little bit about that?
Thank you. That's a great continuation because, of course, this may not come as a surprise, but I can't underemphasize. I need to continue to emphasize. When we did our protected retirement income planning study, which is very rigorous, we see over 40% of women are single. So when you start thinking about what that looks like for someone who will have, and this can be paralyzing. So Bruno, going back to the healthcare conversation, I know you're in Canada, so lucky you. But those of us in the United States, we have a lot of cost associated, even if you're healthy, right? So I think those conversations, Tisa, to my mind, and I am not a financial advisor, but just writing about it, caring about it, it needs to be helping those women understand, and they probably took care of elderly relatives, right? So they kind of know what this is going to cost, but helping them understand it, fund it. So I guess I'm allowed to say this. I actually have a long-term care policy myself. I just bought it. So I'm probably the classic, right? 58, probably maybe could have bought it a little bit younger. But I like having that leverage. So Bruno, back to actuarial science, I like that, a dollar goes in and a few more come out, right? So there's a nice kind of leverage there. But those questions, I think, Tisa, are critical. Also, I think getting into this conversation of this chromatophobia, when we think about, and I'm using that term more and more versus the old one, bag lady syndrome, which I find is pretty pejorative, certainly with the homeless and unhoused population that we have. But anyway, this can happen to women a lot because they do know they're going to live longer. So back to this license to spend, I think we didn't zero in on women per se in this paper, but I do think that there's a lot there to explore. So those conversations, I think, are critical.
Thanks, Bruno.
Well, I think it's a really good point, and it just goes back on the intricacies between all of those those issues. And to your point, a healthy person is going to spend more on healthcare if they live longer. Like it's that simple. Meds, routine doctor visits. So that kind of strengthens the point on lifetime income, and that's literally just going back full circle. On the Canadian thing, I'm not gonna comment because that's a little controversial, but it's I'd say there's issues and there's risks on both sides of the border. how how people view them, how people address them are different. But these things, these issues are there to stay, and hopefully we'll find some societal and industry solutions, because we're dealing with long periods of time. It's not just, okay, how is it today? I'm 65 today, and what if I'm 90, and what's my portfolio look like? Well, there's a different society, a different environment when I'm going to be 90 years old, and that's part of the risk as well.
Well, and if I may do a little offshoot from that, you just made me. I'd like to share another element that we brought out in the research summit. Chris High, who is one of our research fellows and has written a few papers for us, and has a great passion for this intersection of cognitive decline and our financial lives. So I would definitely point people to some of Chris's work, because this is, when you said it, Bruno, I'm thinking 90. There's a lot of stuff I do not want to have to deal with anymore. So, having this guaranteed income would be kind of nice and also simplify my life. But there are a lot of things that we do need to be thinking about and putting into place, not just all of our legal documents, but, this understanding that, in fact, I was out this week and I picked up an AARP brochure, just talking about all the fraud risks, right? We teach this all the time, but I think that family conversation, so kind of going back to everything everyone said today, is whether you're working with a financial professional and Chris has created some of these conversation starters, having those conversations earlier rather than later, particularly with the cognitive decline, I think is critical, because we do see that there are a lot of things that could be resolved just by having, even if it's just one trusted family member or friend or financial advisor. So that's an element I would bring into this conversation too.
Yeah, and that's, I tell you, that's easier said than done, having lived through that with a couple of parents. It's especially, I think my generation of parents, I think they're stubborn, they're independent, they don't want anybody to take control of their money before they're gone. Boy, that we have a whole nother episode on.
I know.
On
Or
dealing with
5.
those issues.
I know. Well, and maybe I'll bring it back to just, one other element that was in the license to spend paper, which I like referencing back to the emotions and the psychology, is this concept of wealth and income is different. So that, goes back to Thaler and, all the research that's been done. And I do think that if we can help educate, and the Alliance, of course, is there as the not-for-profit to educate the consumer about retirement. That's our mission, right? But helping advisors understand that too, that wealth and income are distinctly different when it comes to how clients perceive that.
Yeah. Well, so Suzanne, this was great, and by the way, it shouldn't be a couple of years. We need to have you back, sooner. Talk a little bit more about this. But thanks for your time. Bruno, Tisa, was great. I want to thank our listeners. Thanks for joining us. And listen, be sure to share this episode with your friends. And I think we covered issues that I'm sure a lot of people, Suzanne, need help thinking about. And join us again next week for another great episode of That Annuity Show. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information or listen to more episodes at thatannuityshow.com. Nassau Financial Group is always working harder to be your carrier of choice. We build products that help protect people's savings and are dedicated to providing you with best-in-class service. We seek to keep things simple and have your back in the years to come. Nassau is headquartered in Hartford, Connecticut. Learn more at nfg.com.
Zinnia, an Eldridge Industries business, simplifies insurance. It delivers comprehensive solutions for the industry's most critical needs and creates the modern rails of the insurance industry.
To learn more about Zinnia, please visit zinnia.com.